Alright, after that soothing introduction, we're going to go ahead and get into the start of our video. So our first two terms are the sick man of Europe, which is the Ottoman Empire, and the sick man of the East, which is China. We're going to start with the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 was commonly known as the sick man of Europe because it was a sign that the once great power was crumbling. Up until then, the Turks had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for half a millennium, yet by the 20th century, all that remained in Ottoman hands outside Turkey was Syria, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Then, with the sick man of the East, the phrase sick man of Asia, or the sick man of the East, originally referred to China in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries when it was riven by internal divisions and taken advantage of by the great powers through force. Alright, to start out with the Ottoman Empire, it's first important to note that the Ottoman Empire was not completely cohesive. And I mean that because the Sultan, Mahmud II, ran into trouble with provincial governors because they had their own ambitions. This led the Sultan to enact the Tanzimat, which was a series of governmental reforms between 1839 and 1876 that sought to centralize and rationalize Ottoman rule within the empire, and also to capture more tax revenues for the military defense of the empire. Then the Sultan asked Britain to intervene in Syria on behalf of the Ottoman Empire to restore control for the Ottoman Empire. But this allowed Britain and France to ask for extremely favorable trading privileges as well as the full enactment of the Tanzimat. And then the Ottoman Empire was pretty much like, hooray, we're saved! But they had forced to realize that they had pretty much become a colony for the British, and they were forced to export raw materials to the British, which ultimately made them poor, and during the Crimean War they had to borrow money from the French on extremely unfavorable terms, which later led to the Ottoman Public Debt Commission. And the Ottoman Public Debt Commission was a European-controlled organization that was established in 1881 to collect the payments which the Ottoman Empire owed to European companies and the Ottoman public debt. The OPDA became a vast, essentially independent bureaucracy within the Ottoman bureaucracy, run by the creditors and its governing council. It's also important to know that the British and the French were in charge of the Ottoman Public Debt Commission, meaning that they had complete control over the Ottoman economy.
China, 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 China now, China, China. You know.
Welcome back, folks. First off, we're going to talk about the Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties of China, spanning the years of 1644 to 1911. Under the Qing dynasty, the territory of the empire grew to treble its size under the preceding Ming dynasty. Under the Qing dynasty, the population grew from some 150 million to 450 million. Many of the non-Chinese minorities within the empire were Sinicized, and an integrated national economy was established. I think it's also important to know that China was relatively isolated from the rest of Europe, and that was until the introduction of opium smoking. And in contrast, Europe had been a long-eared consumer of Chinese goods like silk, porcelain, and tea. But this all drastically changed with the introduction of opium smoking because it became so entrenched in Chinese society that the emperor actually had to ban imports on opium. And when the British companies refused to stop selling the opium, this basically led to the Opium War. The first Opium War, which was 1839 through 42, was fought between China and Britain, and the second Opium War was 1856 to 1860. It was also known as the Arrow War, or the Anglo-French War in China, and it was fought by Britain and France against China. In each of these wars, the foreign powers were victorious and gained commercial privileges and legal and territorial concessions in China. The Treaty of Nanking was a peace treaty which ended the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. This was between the United Kingdom and the Qing dynasty of China. On the 29th of August 1842, it was officially ended. It was the first of what the Chinese later called the unequal treaties on the ground that Britain had no obligations in return. This led to increased extraterritorial rights for Britain in China. So extraterritorial is the state of being exempted from the jurisdiction of local law, usually as a result of diplomatic negotiations. So extraterritorial can also be applied to physical places, such as foreign embassies, military bases of foreign countries, like the British in China. The defeats suffered in the Opium War would lead to the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was a radical political and religious upheaval that was probably the most important event in China in the 19th century. It lasted for some 14 years, 1850 to 1864. It ravaged 17 provinces, took an estimated 20 million lives, and irrevocably altered the Qing dynasty. This led to the emergence of Charles Gordon. He made his military reputation in China, where he was placed in command of the ever-victorious army, which was a force of Chinese soldiers led by European officers. In the early 1860s, Gordon and his men were instrumental in putting down the Taiping Rebellion, regularly defeating much larger forces. For these accomplishments, he was given the name Chinese Gordon. It was really a nickname, to be honest, and honors from both the Emperor of China and the British. Another important term is the open door policy. The purpose of the open door policy was to give all nations equal rights when trading with China. It was initiated by the United States and aimed to both enhance global trade and to promote China's welfare and sovereignty. Next, in 1900, in what became known as the Boxer Rebellion, a Chinese secret organization called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists led an uprising in northern China against the spread of Western and Japanese influence there. A key Chinese figure, known as the father of modern China, Sun Yat-sen played a key role in abolishing the Qing dynasty in China and was the first provincial president of the Republic of China when it was first set up in 1912. Expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim was partly due to the British East India Company's desire to protect their trade routes between China and India. This led to expansion into Australia and New Zealand. But Britain's aggressive expansion soon came to a halt with the Charter Act of 1833, because as this act was also intended to provide for the extension of the Royal Charter granted to the East India Company, it also called the Charter Act of 1833, which extended the charter by 20 years. It contained the following provisions: that it redesignated the Governor-General of Bengal as the Governor-General of India. This Charter Act of 1833 also destroyed the entire monopoly of China trade that the British East India Company had at the time, and this caused Britain to look elsewhere for advantageous colonial developments. And this brought Siam, or modern-day Thailand, into an intense westernization program, which had reforms such as a Europeanized or Western education system. It's also important to know that Siam was not making its own decisions, and what I mean by that is Britain was behind the scenes telling them what to do. In a sense, it was almost a hidden form of colonization by the British. And then the British expanded into Australia and New Zealand. And Australia was originally set up as a penal colony, which a penal colony is a settlement used to exile prisoners and separate them from the general population by placing them in a remote location, which is usually an island or distant colonial territory, as seen with Australia. And the funny part is, Britain actually discouraged immigration to Australia. But with the Australian gold rush of 1851, an increasing numbers of settlers poured into Australia. And New Zealand experienced similar patterns. And then next with the White Dominions, which was a word used for colonies in which European settlers made up the overwhelming majority of the population, there were also small numbers of native inhabitants, were typically reduced by disease and wars of conquest. And then this is typical with British holdings in North America and Australia, for example, with growing independence in the 19th century. As you can see, race became a huge factor. And what I mean by race is the classification of humans into groups based on physical traits, ancestry, genetics, or the relations between them. It's also important to know that Britain didn't just economically impact Australia, they also affected the indigenous populations, which what I mean by that is they pretty much wiped out the entire indigenous population of Australia and New Zealand with disease and war. Wait, what's that? Does anyone else hear that? First, with Japan, I think it's important for you to know that Japan was the only country that really escaped European rule. The first instance of Europeans wanting to end Japanese isolationism was with Matthew Perry. No, not Chandler, but on July 8, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy commanded a squadron of 2 steamers and 2 sailing vessels. He tried to force Japan to enter into trade with the United States and demanded a treaty permitting trade and the opening of Japanese ports to U.S. merchant ships. This was the era when all Western ports were seeking to open new markets for their manufactured goods abroad, as well as new countries to supply raw materials for industry. This trade brought much foreign currency into Japan, disrupting the Japanese monetary system. Because the ruling shoguns seemed unable to do anything about the problems brought by foreign trade, some samurai leaders began to demand a change in leadership. And the current leadership was the Tokugawa government. Japan's Tokugawa, or Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1867, would be the final era of traditional Japanese government, culture, and society before the Meiji Restoration of 1868 toppled the long-reigning Tokugawa shoguns and propelled the country into the modern era. And while that was happening, the Sino-Japanese War was going on. This was between China and Japan over the control of Korea that resulted in the independence of Korea and the Chinese cession to Japan of Formosa and the Pescadores. Then, with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan over the rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. Not only did this defeat devastate Russia, but also showed the boundaries of European expansion. Another important term to know that happened before the Russo-Japanese War was the Meiji Restoration, because in 1868, the Tokugawa shogun, who ruled Japan in the feudal period, lost his power and the emperor was restored to the supreme position. The emperor took the name Meiji, which means enlightened rule, as his reign name. This event was known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan marked a new imperialism. With many similarities to the West, Japanese imperialism differed from Western imperialism, and that it was the first non-Western imperial power, and that it rose to imperial status after facing colonization by the West.